They couldn't see land on the other side. There was no land on the other side, not one they could see anyway. And yet they built rafts, or canoes, or something we still don't fully understand, and they crossed open ocean to reach a continent no human being had ever set foot on. That continent was Australia. By the time the first European ships arrived in 1606, the descendants of those original travelers had been living on that continent continuously, for longer than the pyramids have existed, longer than Stonehenge, longer than agriculture in Mesopotamia, longer than written language anywhere on Earth. And here's the part that should stop you in your tracks. They didn't just survive that whole time. They built, without metal, without writing, without the wheel, one of the most sophisticated knowledge systems humanity has ever produced. A system for storing law, history, science, geography, and ethics, and passing it down with such precision that some of it has survived, essentially unchanged, for thousands of generations. This video is about that system, about songlines that work as GPS, about a fish trap older than the pyramids, about a six-season calendar more accurate than the one most of us use, about medicine the Western world is only now catching up to. This isn't a story about the past. Large parts of it are still being practiced right now by people who never stopped. Let's get into it. Section 1. The Library with No Books. Here's a problem worth sitting with for a second. How do you preserve detailed, accurate information, not just stories, but real operational knowledge, for tens of thousands of years without writing anything down? Most of us assume that without writing, knowledge degrades. It becomes myth, exaggeration, a game of telephone played across centuries. That's actually a reasonable assumption. It's just wrong, at least in this case. And the reason it's wrong is one of the most underrated discoveries in modern anthropology. Many Aboriginal groups across Australia developed something English speakers call songlines, sometimes called dreaming tracks. It's worth pausing on that translation because songline undersells what's actually going on. A songline isn't a song in the way we think of songs. It's closer to an operating system. A single songline can function simultaneously as a map, a history book, a law code, a religious tradition, and a field guide to the local ecology. The same verse that tells a creation story about an ancestral being also tells you exactly where the next waterhole is, how far away it is, and what's growing near it. Walk the song in order, and you are, quite literally, navigating the country. Some songlines stretch for hundreds, even over 1,000 kilometers, crossing the territories of dozens of different language groups, each singing their own section in their own language, with the root, the rhythm, and the underlying story staying intact the whole way. Researcher Lynn Kelly, who spent over a decade studying this for her PhD and later co-wrote a book on it with Aboriginal scholar Margot Neal, found something remarkable when she dug into the actual content of these songlines. Up to 70% of the material encoded within them is practical ecological knowledge, information about animals, plants, and seasons. Not 70% myth with a side of trivia. The majority of the content is functional survival information, wrapped in story because story is what sticks in a human brain. And it's not just songlines. Aboriginal elders are documented as routinely holding what amounts to an encyclopedic memory. Knowledge of hundreds of species of animals, mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, invertebrates, alongside an equal number of plants, complex genealogies stretching back generations, navigation routes across hundreds of kilometers, land management techniques, astronomy, law, ethics, and geology. Think about that list again. That's not a party trick. That's the information load of a university library, held entirely in human memory, transmitted person to person, generation to generation, with enough fidelity that explorers, anthropologists, and now neuroscientists keep independently verifying details encoded in songs sung the same way for possibly thousands of years. Here's where it gets genuinely mind-bending. This isn't just an Aboriginal curiosity. Kelly's research suggests the same underlying technique, anchoring information to a journey through real or imagined physical space, is the same trick behind the memory palace methods used by Roman orators, and may even explain how Stonehenge and other Neolithic monuments functioned. not as temples in the way we usually picture them, but as memory architecture, physical walking routes that helped non-literate societies all over the world store and retrieve enormous amounts of knowledge. In other words, what looks at first like a uniquely Australian phenomenon may actually be a window into how human memory worked everywhere. Before writing took over, Aboriginal Australia just happens to be the place where this technology survived long enough and intact enough for us to actually study it working. Section 2. Reading a landscape like a living text. Now imagine you're an elder walking through your country. You notice a particular plant has started flowering. You notice a certain bird has just arrived from its migration. You notice how insects are behaving and which way the wind is blowing this week compared to last. From that alone, you can infer which fish are spawning right now, which plant foods will be ready to harvest in coming weeks, whether rain is coming, which areas should be avoided, and which should be visited. This is not guesswork. This is applied ecological science, built from an observational dataset spanning tens of thousands of years and refined across countless generations, with no written record, held entirely in memory, language, and song, and corrected in real time against what's actually happening on the ground. One of the clearest illustrations of this is something most of us never think to question: the 4 seasons. Spring, summer, autumn, winter. It feels like a fact of nature, but it's actually a fairly crude European import, built for a hemisphere with a very different climate than most of Australia. Many Aboriginal groups, especially across the country's north, never used 4 seasons at all. They recognized 6, 7, or more, seasons defined not by a fixed date on a calendar, but by what was actually happening in the world around them. Consider the Noongar people of southwestern Australia, whose 6-season calendar tracks things like when certain trees flower, when particular animals breed, and when the weather patterns genuinely shift, rather than forcing the year into 4 equal arbitrary chunks. It's a system that adjusts to reality instead of asking reality to conform to a Roman calendar designed for a different continent entirely. This single example tells you something important about the whole knowledge system. It was never static or ancient in the sense of frozen in time. It was actively, continuously updated by observation. It's science in the truest sense, testable, falsifiable, refined by results. It just never needed a peer-reviewed journal to validate it, because the validation was simpler and harsher. If your seasonal knowledge was wrong, you didn't eat. Section 3. The sky as a second landscape. Look up at the Milky Way on a clear night from the Australian outback, and most Western observers see scattered points of light. Many Aboriginal sky watchers see something else entirely: a dark shape, formed not from the stars themselves, but from the dust clouds blotting them out. Where most astronomical traditions connect the dots between bright stars, this one reads the shadows between them. It's called the Emu in the sky. Its head is the Coalsack Nebula near the Southern Cross, its long neck and body stretching down through the galactic core towards Scorpius. Bruce Pascoe's well-known book, Dark Emu, actually takes its title from this constellation, known as Gugarmin to the Wiradjuri people. And the emu in the sky isn't just decorative, it's functional astronomy. When certain constellations rise or set at particular times of year, they signal exactly when real emus are building nests, or when their eggs are ready to be collected. Astrophysicist Kirsten Banks, who studies this tradition, put it simply: it works like a seasonal menu written across the galaxy. This wasn't limited to one group's stargazing hobby. It was widespread, precise, and operationally important across the continent. The Burong people of Victoria tracked the constellation we call Lyra. When it appeared in March, it signaled that malleefowl were about to start nesting. When it disappeared in October, the eggs were ready to collect. Elsewhere, the rising of Scorpius told Yolngu people in the north that Makassar fishermen from Indonesia would soon arrive to fish for sea cucumber, meaning the night sky wasn't just predicting natural events, it was predicting the arrival of other human beings, across the sea, hundreds of years before European contact. Visual rock engraving footage, Ku-ring Gai Chase. There's a rock engraving of an emu in Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park, just north of Sydney, carved by the Ku-ring-gai people. Researchers have found that the engraving is oriented to align precisely with the emu in the sky constellation. At exactly the time of year emus are laying their eggs, stone, sky and season locked together in a single piece of art that was also a working calendar. This is the part that tends to surprise people most. By some estimates, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples were studying and navigating by the night sky long before the astronomical traditions of Babylon, Greece or Rome even began. Not a similar achievement happening in parallel. Earlier. Section 4. Fire as a tool, not a disaster. For most of us, fire in the Australian landscape means one thing: catastrophe. Roaring, uncontrollable bushfires that destroy everything in their path. But for tens of thousands of years, Aboriginal peoples related to fire completely differently. Not as a threat to be prevented, but as a tool to be wielded, deliberately and with extraordinary precision. Archaeologist Rhys Jones gave this practice a memorable name: fire stick farming. Early European travellers like Edward Eyre, Ludwig Leichhardt, and Thomas Mitchell all independently observed the same pattern: grass deliberately burned in patchwork mosaics, designed to reduce fuel loads and to encourage fresh green growth that would draw in grazing animals. This wasn't random burning. It was a finely tuned system, varying region to region, that historian Bill Gamage spent years reconstructing in his landmark book, The Biggest Estate on Earth. His argument, controversial to some ecologists but backed by extensive colonial-era written and visual records, is that the untouched wilderness early European settlers thought they were discovering wasn't untouched at all. Gamage details how the very land that became the sites of Sydney, Brisbane, Hobart, Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, Darwin and Canberra showed clear signs of long-term fire management: open grassy country that likely shaped exactly where European settlers chose to put down roots in the first place. Think about the implication of that for a second. The park-like landscapes that early settlers admired and wrote home about weren't naturally occurring. Gamage's argument is that the whole continent functioned as a deliberately managed cultural landscape, shaped and maintained by precise, repeated, controlled fire, to the point that one settler-era description called it a landscape of farms without fences. And the science behind when and where to burn drew on exactly the kind of ecological reading we talked about earlier. Knowing which plants, animals, and weather signals meant it was the right moment, the right place, the right intensity. Get it wrong, and you either don't reduce the fuel load enough, or you damage the very plants and animals you depend on. Get it right, repeated over thousands of years, and you produce a landscape that simply does not build up the kind of catastrophic fuel loads that drive today's megafires. This is not ancient history. Cultural burning is being actively revived right now, with Aboriginal corporations partnering with fire agencies and park services across Australia. In Victoria, the Dja Wurrung Clan's Aboriginal Corporation has worked directly with government environment departments and Parks Victoria since 2017 to bring cultural burning back onto country, not as a museum piece, but as active land management that modern fire science is increasingly recognizing as effective. Section 5. The fish trap older than the pyramids. Now for one of the single most astonishing facts in this entire video, one that, if it were almost anywhere else in the world, would be a compulsory chapter in every world history textbook. In southwestern Victoria sits a place called Budge Bim, on the country of the Gunditjmara people. Tens of thousands of years ago, a volcano erupted here, and the resulting lava flow reshaped the local wetlands. The Gunditjmara looked at that transformed landscape and didn't just adapt to it, they re-engineered it. Using the volcanic rock left behind, they built an elaborate, interconnected system of channels, weirs, and dams designed to trap, store, and harvest short-finned eels, known locally as kuyang. Researchers using 3D computer modeling have shown these weren't simple barriers. They were sophisticated holding ponds, engineered to keep eels alive and growing at different life stages, available to harvest across much of the year rather than just during a single migration window. This is, by definition, aquaculture, deliberate, managed farming of an aquatic species. And the age of this system is almost hard to process. Archaeologists have dated parts of the system to at least 6,600 years old, and many of these channels are still functional and still in use today. Let that sit for a moment. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built roughly 4,500 years ago. This aquaculture system already had 1,000+ years of operational history before the pyramids existed, and it's still working. The Gunditjmara wove long, funnel-shaped baskets to trap eels within this system of weirs, and also caught turtles and fish using the same network. The eels weren't just food. They were valuable enough to trade with other Aboriginal groups at large intergroup gatherings. This single piece of infrastructure supported a stable, settled economy, not the popular stereotype of small, constantly roaming bands, but established communities living in stone dwellings near a reliable, managed food source for thousands of years. In 2019, Budge Bim became the first place in Australia to receive UNESCO World Heritage status, purely for its Aboriginal cultural and engineering significance, recognized finally on the world stage as exactly what it is, one of the oldest deliberate aquaculture systems on Earth. Section 6. Outsmarting the water itself. Across the continent, away from Budge Bim's permanent stone infrastructure, Aboriginal groups developed an entirely different, and genuinely clever, fishing technique, poisoning the water itself. Not to kill the fish outright, but to stun them just enough to bring them to the surface. In the Kimberley region, Gajarabeng people crushed leaves from a local mangrove plant and swept the branches through waterholes until stunned fish began floating belly up. The skill wasn't in the plant alone, it was in the dosage. The trick was managing exactly how much of the toxic plant material went into the water. Enough to stun the fish, not enough to wipe out the entire waterhole's population. This required real botanical and ecological expertise, and it wasn't limited to one region or one plant. Early ethnographic surveys recorded more than 20 different plant species used this way across Australia. Different chemistry, different waterholes, different target fish, all calibrated through generations of trial, observation, and refinement. One particularly striking detail: in the central desert, some groups discovered how to release the active alkaloids from a plant by chewing it together with the ash of a completely different plant, the ash supplying exactly the right chemical conditions needed to unlock the first plant's properties. That's not folklore. That's applied chemistry, arrived at without a laboratory, refined over an unknowable number of generations of careful observation. Fish poisoning was just one tool in a much larger toolkit. Hunters also used the boomerang, and contrary to the popular image, most boomerangs were never designed to return at all. The majority were heavier, non-returning throwing sticks, optimized purely for distance and stopping power against kangaroos, emus, and other game. In skilled hands, these could be thrown directly at prey or skipped off the ground to strike up to 100 meters away. And the much more famous returning boomerang most of the world recognizes today was, in many regions, the variant used for play, ceremony, and luring birds into nets, not the primary hunting weapon at all. And this technology runs deep. At the Madjed Bebe site in northern Australia, archaeologists have found the earliest known evidence anywhere on Earth of edge-ground stone hatchets, produced and used roughly 65,000 years ago, alongside the earliest known intensive grinding of seeds for food and ground ochre pigment for art. Ground-edge axe technology, a real engineering leap over simply flaking stone, didn't slowly diffuse into Australia from somewhere else. It emerged independently here, without contact with the rest of Eurasia, making it one of the oldest known examples of this technology anywhere in the world. Section 7. The bush as a pharmacy. Walk through Australian bushland with the right knowledge, and you're not walking through wilderness, you're walking through a fully stocked pharmacy. Take the tea tree, Melaleuca alternifolia. For the Bundjalung people of eastern Australia, its leaves weren't just a folk remedy. They were a frontline medical tool, crushed and inhaled to ease coughs, applied directly to wounds to prevent infection, and brewed as infusions for sore throats and skin conditions. Here's the part that should change how you think about the word traditional medicine. In the 1920s, formal scientific testing found that tea tree oil's antiseptic potency was actually stronger than the standard antiseptics doctors were using at the time. This wasn't a comforting placebo validated decades later by sympathetic researchers. It was empirically more effective, tested against the Western medical standard of its own era. And tea tree oil is now a global commercial product, sitting in pharmacies and supermarkets on every continent. And tea tree is far from the only example. The Kakadu plum, native to the Northern Territory, holds the record for the highest vitamin C concentration of any fruit yet measured on Earth. More recently, researchers studying the leaves of the emu bush plant, long used by Northern Territory groups to treat sores, cuts, and wounds, found their antibacterial strength comparable to established pharmaceutical antibiotics, and South Australian scientists are now investigating using the compound to sterilize medical implants like artificial hips. This is a genuinely active area of biomedical research today, not because Western scientists are discovering these properties from scratch, but because they're catching up to applied knowledge that was already tested, refined, and working for an enormous span of time before anyone wrote a research paper about it. Section 8. A necessary pause. What we don't know and what isn't ours to know. Before we close this out, two honest notes. First, not everything in this story is settled fact. Some of the boldest claims about pre-colonial Aboriginal land use, particularly Bruce Pascoe's widely read book Dark Emu, which argued for extensive agriculture, permanent settlements, and large-scale food storage across the continent, have been seriously challenged by some historians and anthropologists, including a detailed critical response from researchers Peter Sutton and Kerin Walshy. The honest picture is one of real scholarly debate, not a single settled narrative. That debate doesn't undermine the things we've covered tonight, which rest on multiple independent lines of evidence, but it's worth knowing the conversation is still very much alive, and that the truth is probably more regionally varied and complicated than any single book captures. Second, and just as important, this video has only scratched the surface, and deliberately so. Australia is home to hundreds of distinct Aboriginal language groups, each with their own specific knowledge, names, and laws. There is no single unified Aboriginal system, and flattening that diversity does a disservice to how genuinely vast this is. And some of the knowledge tied to songlines, ceremonies, and seasonal calendars is sacred and restricted, deliberately not meant for general public circulation. What you've heard tonight is the knowledge that communities and researchers have chosen to share publicly. It is a real and fascinating doorway. But it is not, and was never meant to be, the whole house. Closing. Why this matters now. Here's what I keep coming back to. We tend to measure advanced civilization by a fairly narrow checklist: writing systems, monumental architecture, metal tools. By that checklist, it's easy, and wrong, to dismiss what we've covered tonight as simple, but hold every piece up against that checklist differently. A memory system precise enough to transmit real, checkable information across hundreds of generations without writing. An aquaculture engineering project that predates the pyramids and is still functioning today. A calendar system responsive enough to track reality instead of forcing reality into a fixed grid. A pharmacy of plant medicine independently arrived at, that 20th century science is still in the process of confirming. A fire management practice so effective that we're now racing to relearn it as our forests burn hotter and longer than they have in recorded history. None of this needed metal. None of it needed writing. It needed something else entirely. An extraordinarily patient, careful, multi-generational relationship with observation, memory, and land, refined for over 65,000 years by people who never stopped paying attention. The most humbling thought of all might be this: a huge amount of this knowledge is not lost. It's not something to be excavated from ruins. It is actively held, practiced, and taught today by elders and communities who never stopped carrying it. Through colonization, through dispossession, through every attempt, intentional or not, to make them stop. That continuity, against those odds, might be the single most remarkable fact in this entire video. If this kind of deep-time human ingenuity fascinates you as much as it fascinates me, let me know in the comments which fact hit hardest, and subscribe, because this is far from the only knowledge system on Earth that deserves a much closer look.